"Sir, be quiet," the little black girl whispered, her voice trembling but steady enough to cut through the chaos around her. The billionaire lay on the marble floor of his own corporate lobby, his expensive suit soaked in spilled coffee and panic. People shouted, cell phones flashed, someone called for help, but she was already on her knees beside him. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked again. No answer. His face was pale, his lips fading to a color she did not like. The girl looked around. "He is not breathing," she said, louder this time. A woman screamed. No one moved. They were all too afraid, too unsure. She took a deep breath, her small hands shaking. "Be quiet," she whispered to him again, as if her words could calm the storm itself. Then she pressed her hands on his chest the way her grandmother had shown her years ago when their neighbor fell outside the grocery store. 1, 2, 3. She counted each push softly, her breath fogging against the cold marble. "Come on, sir. Please breathe," she murmured. She leaned forward, checking his mouth, his nose, then did the only thing she could think of. She closed her eyes and gave him air. It was not a kiss of love. It was a kiss of life. Warm breath into cold silence. Around her, the world froze. The security guard's radio crackled, the elevator dinged, someone sobbed quietly. Then, a sound, a small gasp, weak but real. His chest rose slightly. She gasped too, her eyes wide, tears breaking free before she could stop them. "You are okay," she whispered. "You are going to be okay." The man's eyes fluttered open for half a second, confused, lost, then closed again as paramedics burst through the doors. "Step back, kid," one of them said. But she stayed until they took over. Her tiny hands stained with the color of effort and courage. She stood up slowly, her backpack sliding down her shoulder, one strap torn, and she backed away into the crowd that had started to record everything. No one knew her name, no one asked. She turned and walked toward the glass doors, her sneakers squeaking softly against the tile, leaving behind a billionaire who would wake up in a few hours not knowing the name of the child who had brought him back to life. The sirens wailed outside, reflecting off the building's mirror walls, and as she stepped into the sunlight, she looked back once. The automatic doors closed between them with a soft hiss, and the city kept moving, unaware that a little girl's courage had just changed everything. The steady rhythm of machines filled the quiet hospital room. The billionaire's chest rose and fell beneath a thin white blanket, a line of pale light cutting across his face from the blinds. Monitors blinked, steady and cold. Hours had passed since the chaos in the lobby, and yet the memory of a small girl's voice still echoed faintly through the sterile air. The nurse adjusted the IV line, noting his pulse, unaware that her patient had begun to stir. His fingers twitched first, then his eyelids fluttered. The man groaned softly, his head heavy, vision swimming into focus. He saw the edge of the hospital bed, the tubes, the faint smell of antiseptic, and then the uniformed paramedic by the door. "You are lucky," the paramedic said when he noticed him awake. "Whoever that little girl was, she saved your life before we got there." The billionaire frowned, his mind hazy. "Little girl?" His voice cracked, foreign in his own throat. The paramedic nodded. "About 8 or 9, maybe younger. She started CPR right there on the lobby floor. She kept going until we arrived. If she had not, well, let's just say your heart owes her." The man blinked slowly, absorbing the words. He tried to speak, but the room spun. His throat was dry, his mind a blur of images, bright lights, voices shouting, a tiny pair of hands pressing against his chest. He remembered warmth, breath, a whisper, "Sir, be quiet." The memory hit him like a flash of lightning through fog. He exhaled shakily. "Where is she?" he asked, sitting up a little. The paramedic shrugged. "No one knows. By the time we loaded you in the ambulance, she was gone." The billionaire fell silent. Outside the window, the city pulsed as if nothing had happened. But something had. For the first time in years, he felt small, fragile, human. His name was Charles Whitman, a man whose signature alone could move millions of dollars, whose company owned 3 skyscrapers downtown. He had survived boardroom wars, hostile takeovers, and public scandals, but nothing had prepared him for the idea that his life now continued because a child, an absolute stranger, had refused to look away. Later that afternoon, his assistant arrived with a tablet full of reports, trying to resume the rhythm of business. "Sir, the board wants an update. There are questions about your health and about that incident," she said carefully. Charles looked at her, his eyes distant. "Find her," he said quietly. "The girl. I want to know who she is." His assistant hesitated. "Sir, there were dozens of witnesses. Maybe the security footage can help." "Do it," he said, his tone soft but absolute. When she left, the room grew still again. Charles looked at his reflection in the window, at the faint bruises along his jaw. The monitor beeped rhythmically beside him. "Be quiet," he whispered to himself, the words echoing with strange comfort. Across town, the little girl sat at the edge of a worn couch in a small apartment that smelled faintly of soap and old bread. Her grandmother's breathing wheezed softly from the other room. The girl's name was Lila. She was 8 years old, her hair tied into short braids, and her jeans had a rip at the knee that she had tried to stitch with blue thread. The television flickered, showing news about a billionaire collapsing in his lobby, rescued by an unknown young bystander. Lila lowered the volume, her fingers clutching the edge of the couch. She did not like the word bystander. She had not stood by. She had moved. Her grandmother called weakly from the bedroom. "Lila, the soup is ready?" "Almost, Grandma," she said, hurrying to the kitchen. She ladled broth into a chipped bowl, her small hands steady despite the tiredness in her eyes. She did not know that the man she had saved was already looking for her. Back in the hospital, Charles watched the footage from the security cameras. The girl was small, maybe 7 or 8, wearing a red backpack that looked too heavy for her shoulders. The video showed her kneeling, pressing on his chest, her lips moving as if praying. Then she disappeared into the crowd. The image froze on her face for a moment, determined, terrified, human. "Enhance the frame," he told the technician. The grainy picture sharpened just enough to show her expression clearly. "Find her," he repeated. That night, he could not sleep. He stared at the ceiling, haunted not by fear of death but by the sound of her voice telling him to be quiet, as if she had known that silence was what would save him. In the quiet hours before dawn, he made a decision. For years, he had believed that strength came from control, from power, from speaking louder than others. But that child had saved him with calm, with courage, and with a voice no one else had listened to. Somewhere in the vast city, she was just a little girl again, maybe washing dishes, maybe doing homework, unaware that the man whose life she had touched was now wide awake and searching for her. The monitors in his room hummed softly, steady and alive, echoing the rhythm of a heart that now beat because of her. The morning sun washed the hospital room in pale gold, glinting off the glass vase by the window. Charles Whitman sat upright, his body weaker than his will, his mind replaying the same image again and again, the little girl's face leaning over him, whispering, "Sir, be quiet." That voice had become an echo that refused to fade. His assistant entered quietly, holding a thin folder. "Sir, we have something." The security footage helped, and one of the guards remembered seeing her leave toward the subway station on 5th and Lawson. Charles took the folder with trembling hands. Inside was a blurry still image of the child's small frame, the red backpack slung loosely over her shoulder. "Her name?" he asked. "Not yet, but we can find her," the assistant said. "Do it." His tone carried no hesitation, only purpose. Later that day, dressed in a simple gray coat, Charles walked out of the hospital against the doctor's recommendation. He needed to breathe air that did not smell like medicine. The city outside was loud and restless, but to him, it sounded different now, every honk, every footstep, every voice reminding him of life. His driver followed a list of addresses gathered from nearby schools and shelters. Hours passed as they stopped by community centers and small corner stores. Then, as the afternoon light began to thin, he saw her. She was across the street near a laundromat, standing on a crate to reach the payphone. Her hair was braided neatly, her jeans patched, her red backpack hanging by one strap. She was speaking softly into the receiver, her hand cupped over the mouthpiece. Charles crossed the street slowly, afraid that if he moved too fast, she would vanish like a mirage. "Excuse me," he said gently. She turned, startled. Her eyes widened when she recognized him. "You are the man," she whispered, almost like she did not believe he was real. Yes, he said, his voice catching. You saved my life. She shifted awkwardly, clutching the receiver. I just did what I had to do. He smiled faintly. Most people would have walked away. Lila looked down at her shoes. Most people did. The street noise faded into a soft hum around them. He wanted to thank her, but the word felt too small. Can I ask your name? He said. Lila, she answered after a pause. Lila Jenkins. He repeated it quietly, as if it were something sacred. Lila, I owe you more than I can ever repay. She shook her head quickly. You do not owe me anything, sir. I just could not let you die. A bus roared past, blowing dust and paper between them. Where do you live? He asked carefully. Not far, she said, but her tone carried the instinctive caution of someone used to hiding. With my grandma. He nodded, not wanting to push. Would it be all right if I walked with you? She hesitated, glancing down the street as if expecting someone to stop her. Just for a bit, she said finally. They walked side by side down the cracked sidewalk, her steps quick and light, his slower but deliberate. People glanced at them curiously, the powerful man in a tailored coat and the little girl with worn sneakers. You really walked all that way to save me? He asked softly. I was delivering flyers for the church, she said. I saw you fall. Nobody moved. I remembered what my grandma said to do if someone stops breathing. Your grandma sounds like a wise woman, he said. She is, Lila replied, smiling faintly. She says God listens to small voices. Charles looked at her, the weight of those words settling deep inside him. They reached the corner of an old brick building, its walls cracked with age, a hand-painted sign reading, Jenkins Laundry and Repair. This is where I live, she said. Upstairs. He glanced at the narrow staircase leading to the apartments above. Can I meet her? Just to thank her? Lila hesitated again, then nodded. She is sick, but she likes visitors. They climbed the stairs slowly, the air growing warmer with each step. Inside the small apartment, the smell of soup and lavender soap mixed in the air. An elderly woman sat in a chair by the window, a blanket over her knees. Her face lit up when she saw Lila. Grandma, this is the man from the news, Lila said. The old woman smiled weakly. So you are the one my girl saved. Charles bowed his head slightly. I think she saved more than my life, ma'am. They talked softly, the sunlight fading as the city lights began to glow outside. Before he left, he placed his business card on the table, but the grandmother pushed it back gently. If you really want to thank her, she said, just do something kind for someone else. He looked at Lila, then at her grandmother, both of them surrounded by the quiet strength that money could never buy. When he finally stepped outside, the street had grown dark, but for the first time in years, the lights did not seem distant. Somewhere behind him, Lila's laughter floated through the window, a small, clear sound that felt like hope. The next morning, Charles Whitman stood in front of the same brick building that had stayed in his thoughts all night. The faint scent of laundry detergent drifted through the air as he looked up at the second-floor window where he had seen Lila the evening before. The city was still waking, sunlight cutting between buildings, the streets alive with the quiet rhythm of early workers. He carried a paper bag in his hand, filled with groceries and medicine, unsure whether to knock or walk away. His driver waited by the curb, confused to see his boss carrying anything himself. Charles finally climbed the narrow stairs, each creak underfoot echoing in the hallway. When he reached the door, he paused, listening to the sound of soft coughing from inside. He knocked gently. Lila opened the door, surprise spreading across her face. Mr. Whitman? She whispered. You came back. He smiled. I thought your grandmother might like some breakfast. The girl hesitated, glancing toward the small living room where her grandmother sat wrapped in a blanket. She will like that, Lila said quietly, stepping aside. He entered the apartment, the air warm but heavy, the smell of soup faintly lingering. The grandmother looked up, eyes tired but kind. You again, she said with a small smile. You must not have much to do, Mr. Whitman. Actually, he replied softly, setting the bag on the table, I have too much to make up for. Lila helped him unpack apples, oatmeal, fresh milk, cough medicine. She touched the box of tea with both hands, whispering, Grandma loves this kind. The The grandmother thanked him, then coughed again, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. Charles noticed how thin her fingers were, how the room's only heater buzzed weakly near her feet. "Do you have a doctor?" he asked. The grandmother waved it off. "Doctors cost more than this old woman is worth." Lila frowned. "Do not say that, Grandma." Charles met her eyes. "I know someone who can help, and it will not cost anything." The grandmother gave him a long look. "People always say that when they feel guilty." "Which kind are you, mister? Whitman the guilty one or the kind one?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe both." Lila giggled, breaking the tension. Her laughter filled the small space like sunlight slipping through curtains. They spent an hour together, Charles listening as Lila talked about her school, her grandmother's favorite stories, and the way they used to plant flowers in tin cans outside the window when spring came. He found himself laughing softly at her quick humor, her way of making hardship sound like an adventure. Before leaving, he placed a card with a phone number on the table. "If you need anything, day or night, call this number. Someone will come." The grandmother picked it up, studying the print, then set it aside. "You are not used to people saying no to you, are you?" she asked. Charles chuckled. "Not really." "Then consider this a new experience," she said gently. "If we call, it will be because we want to, not because you feel you have to save us." He nodded with respect, understanding that her pride was not something to fix but something to honor. As he stepped outside, Lila followed him to the door. "Mr. Whitman," she said. "Yes? You do not have to bring more food. Just visit." The words struck him deeper than he expected. "I will," he promised. Days turned into a quiet routine. Charles found excuses to stop by after meetings, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes books, sometimes nothing at all. He learned that Lila's father had once worked as a security guard for one of his companies before an accident took him away. The thought sat heavy in his chest. He started making calls, checking old records, finding the file that had been buried under layers of legal paperwork. The more he read, the more guilt settled into his stomach. It had been his company's negligence that caused the accident years ago, and now the daughter of that man had saved his life. That night, he sat in his penthouse apartment, staring at the city lights that stretched like stars below. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. The wealth, the suits, the power, all of it felt small against the courage of a child who had risked everything without asking for anything. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "I want a doctor to visit Mrs. Jenkins tomorrow morning," he said, quietly. "No press, no publicity, and arrange for their rent to be covered for the next 6 months." "Yes, sir," the assistant replied. Charles hesitated before hanging up. "And one more thing," he added. "Find out what happened to the case file on her father's accident." When he ended the call, the apartment felt too large, too empty. He closed his eyes and could almost hear Lila's small voice saying, "You do not owe me anything." Yet he knew that some debts could not be paid with money. The next morning, a doctor arrived at the Jenkins home with new medicine and a warm smile, insisting it was part of a community program. Lila helped her grandmother take the pills, unaware that the man she had saved was watching from across the street, leaning against his car, hands in his coat pockets, a faint smile on his face. He had come to thank her again but stayed silent, realizing that sometimes gratitude was best expressed through action. As the wind brushed against his face, he whispered the same words she once told him, "Be quiet." And for the first time, silence felt like peace. For the first time in many years, Charles Whitman woke before dawn not because of meetings or markets, but because of a feeling he could not name. The city was still half asleep, the streets below his penthouse quiet except for the sound of wind brushing against the glass. He poured himself a cup of coffee but barely touched it. His thoughts were already across town in that small apartment with the flickering heater and the brave little girl who had changed everything. He had arranged for the doctor, the rent, and even a new heater to be delivered that morning. But something about it still felt incomplete. Money solved problems, yet what he felt now could not be solved, only shared. Later that day, he visited again, this time with no driver, no suit, just a dark sweater and a bag of groceries in his hands. Lila opened the door before he could knock twice. "Mr. Whitman, you came back again," she said, smiling. Her braids were pulled tighter today, and her eyes sparkled with the kind of joy that made the gray hallway seem bright. "I told you I would," he replied, stepping inside. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon and soap. Her grandmother sat at the window, looking stronger than before, a soft blanket wrapped around her legs. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Charles greeted her. "You are persistent," the grandmother said with a small laugh, "but I suppose we do not mind the company." Lila helped him place the groceries on the counter, then motioned toward the small table near the window. "We can have tea," she said proudly. "Grandma says guests should always have tea." He smiled. "Then I would be honored." As they poured the steaming liquid into mismatched cups, Charles noticed a drawing taped to the wall. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright Sunday. One was labeled Grandma, one me, and one Mr. C. He pointed to it gently. "Who is Mr. C?" Lila giggled. "That is you, of course." He felt his chest tighten in a way that was both strange and tender. "You made me taller than everyone else," he said softly. "That is because you are taller," she answered, completely serious. Her grandmother chuckled from her chair. They sat together, sipping tea, the world outside fading into the rhythm of their quiet conversation. For a man who spent his life surrounded by boardrooms and polished glass, the chipped cups and uneven table felt more real than anything he had known in years. "Lila," he said after a pause, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" She thought for a moment, twirling the spoon between her fingers. "A doctor," she said finally, "so I can help people like Grandma, and maybe like you, when you fell that day." He nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting. "That is a good dream. Grandma says dreams cost nothing, so we can have as many as we want," Lila added. "But she also says we must work hard to keep them." Her wisdom made him smile. "Your grandmother is right," he said. After tea, he helped fix the window latch that had been stuck for months and replaced the bulb in the hallway light. Lila followed him around, handing him tools from an old tin box. "You are good at fixing things," she said. "Not always," he replied quietly, thinking of the years he had spent breaking trust and losing sight of people like her father. When he finished, he looked around the room, now a little brighter, a little warmer. "Thank you for letting me visit," he said. "You make this place feel like home," the grandmother said kindly. "Most people your age forget what that word means." Charles bowed his head, humbled. As he prepared to leave, Lila reached into her backpack and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. "Wait," she said. "I made this for you." Inside was a small bracelet made of colored string and 2 wooden beads. One was painted gold, the other silver. "It is not much," she said shyly, "but I wanted you to have something lucky." He took it carefully, his eyes soft. "It is more than enough," he said, slipping it onto his wrist. "I will wear it every day." That night, back in his apartment, Charles stood by the window again, the city glowing below. The bracelet rested loosely against his wrist, simple and fragile, yet it carried more weight than his gold watch ever had. He thought of Lila's laughter, of her grandmother's resilience, of the small drawing taped to their wall, and for the first time in years, he prayed not for success, not for fortune, but for strength to be the kind of man that little girl already believed he was. Meanwhile, across the city, Lila lay beside her grandmother, whispering softly, "Do you think Mr. Whitman will really come back again?" "He will," her grandmother said gently. "Some people are meant to find their way home, even if it takes them a lifetime." Outside, the streetlights flickered like distant stars, and somewhere high above, a man who once believed he had everything finally realized what it meant to have something that could not be bought. The night carried their quiet gratitude through the city, binding 2 worlds together with nothing more than kindness and the thin thread of a child's handmade bracelet. The following week arrived with the weight of winter clouds hanging low above the city. Charles Whitman's days had begun to change without him fully realizing it. He no longer rushed from meeting to meeting or filled his schedule with endless numbers and contracts. Instead, his mornings began with a simple ritual. He would pour himself a cup of coffee, touch the bracelet made of string and beads on his wrist, and look out the window at the horizon where the city breathed awake. It reminded him of the little girl who had shown him that life was more than surviving. On that gray Tuesday morning, his assistant entered his office holding a tablet. "Sir, The press has picked up your story again, she said carefully. They want to feature you on the news, the billionaire saved by a child. It is all over social media. Charles leaned back in his chair, frowning slightly. That was weeks ago, he said. Why now? Someone leaked the hospital footage, she replied. The public wants to know who she is. They call her the miracle girl. He looked down at his hands, the bracelet glinting faintly under the office light. Leave it alone, he said quietly. Sir, the media will not stop until they find her. We could use this attention for good publicity. He shook his head. This is not about publicity. That child deserves peace, not cameras in her face. His assistant hesitated, then nodded and left the room. But within hours, the noise outside grew louder. Reporters waited outside his building, journalists called the company nonstop, and headlines screamed stories that twisted the truth into spectacle. By evening, he was pacing near the window, anger and frustration tightening in his chest. He picked up his phone and called one of his contacts in the press. You are not to publish that child's name or location, he said firmly. If you respect anything about what happened, respect her privacy. The voice on the other end stammered an agreement, but Charles knew how the world worked. The next day, photographs appeared online, blurry images of a small girl walking with a red backpack. The caption read, Meet the hero who saved a billionaire's life. Charles's heart sank. Across town, Lila was standing in the small grocery store near her apartment when the cashier gasped, pointing at a newspaper. Lila, is that you? He asked. The paper showed her picture, her name printed in bold letters. She froze, gripping her grandmother's grocery list in her hand. Oh dear, the grandmother whispered. This will bring trouble. By the time they returned home, reporters were already outside the building, shouting questions, cameras flashing. Lila, how did you learn CPR? Did the billionaire promise you money? What do you want from him? Lila hid behind her grandmother's coat, frightened. The old woman raised her hand firmly. Please, leave us alone. That evening, a black car pulled up in front of the building. Charles stepped out, his face drawn with concern. The crowd parted when they saw him. He walked straight to the reporters, his voice calm but commanding. Enough, he said. You have your story. Now go. The street fell silent. Even the cameramen lowered their equipment. This child did what none of you would have done. She saved a stranger without asking who he was. That is all you need to know. His voice echoed off the brick walls, steady and sharp. Then he turned to Lila and her grandmother. I am so sorry, he said softly. Lila looked up at him, her eyes wide and tired. I did not want to be on the news, she whispered. I just wanted everyone to forget about it. I know, he said gently, and I will make sure they do. He led them back inside the apartment, closing the door on the noise outside. The small living room was dim, lit only by the orange glow from the streetlight outside. Lila's grandmother sat slowly, coughing. The world always turns kindness into a headline, she murmured. Charles nodded. Not this time. I will fix it. You cannot fix everything, she said softly, but you can protect what matters. He stayed with them for hours, making calls, arranging for security to keep the reporters away, ensuring that Lila could return to school safely. As the night deepened, Lila sat beside him, her small hand resting over his wrist. You look tired, she said. He smiled faintly. I am just thinking. About what? She asked. About how brave you are, he answered honestly, and about how the world needs more people like you. She looked down, shy but pleased. Grandma says we cannot choose how rich we are, but we can choose how kind. She is right, he said. When he finally left that night, the streets were empty again. The reporters were gone, the air calm. He looked up at their window before stepping into his car. Through the glass, he saw the faint shadow of Lila placing something on the windowsill. It was a candle, glowing softly in the dark. The next morning, when the world woke up, every major news outlet that had covered the story withdrew the girl's name and photo. The headlines changed. They no longer said, Hero Girl. They said, The Quiet Courage That Saved a Life. Charles read it with a small smile. For the first time, the story was not about him or his wealth. It was about her voice, the small, steady whisper that had once told him to be quiet, and had since taught him what it truly meant to listen. By the time a full week had passed, the noise of the reporters had faded, and peace had returned to the narrow street where Lila and her grandmother lived. The candle in their window still flickered each evening, its small flame like a quiet promise that kindness could outlast chaos. Charles Whitman had kept his word. He had used his influence not to promote himself but to protect the girl who had reminded him what it meant to be human. Yet in the glass towers of his company, the board of directors saw things differently. They believed every act of compassion should serve the bottom line. That morning, Charles entered the conference room to find a presentation already glowing on the large screen. The title read, Whitman Industries Community Campaign, The Miracle Girl Initiative. His jaw tightened as the marketing director smiled proudly. Sir, the timing is perfect. Public sympathy is high. We can feature the girl's story as part of our new outreach program. Imagine the headlines. The company that rewards heroism. Charles stared at the screen for a long moment. You want to use her? He asked quietly. Sir, with respect, this is not using her. It is honoring her. People will see us as compassionate. The words scraped against his conscience like sandpaper. And what do you plan to give her? He asked. A scholarship fund, perhaps. We would, of course, require permission to use her image. Charles leaned forward. No, the room fell silent. Sir, this could raise the company's reputation tremendously, another executive insisted. After last quarter's losses, we need something positive. He stood slowly, his chair scraping the floor. You will not turn that child into a marketing tool. She is not a headline. She is a person. The room froze. No one spoke. For the first time in years, Charles's voice carried no trace of negotiation, only conviction. He turned off the projector, gathered his notes, and left without another word. Outside, the winter wind cut through his coat, but he welcomed the cold. It reminded him he was alive, that warmth had to be earned. That evening, he visited Lila and her grandmother again. He knocked lightly, and when the door opened, he saw Lila sitting at the table, working on her homework by the dim light of a lamp. She looked up and smiled. You came back, she said. I always do, he replied. He brought with him a small box wrapped in paper. What is this? She asked curiously. Something that belongs to you, he said. Inside was a small silver necklace with a simple pendant shaped like a heart. For saving mine, he added softly. Lila's eyes widened. It is beautiful, but I cannot take it. You can, he said gently. Because it is not payment, it is gratitude. Her grandmother smiled from her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. That is a fine thing to give a child gratitude instead of gold. Lila clasped the necklace carefully and hugged it to her chest. Thank you, Mr. Whitman. Charles, he corrected with a smile. You can call me Charles. She grinned. All right, Charles. They shared a laugh, the kind that eased the air and made the world feel smaller, warmer. After a while, he turned serious. I have to tell you something. My company wanted to use your story for publicity. They wanted to make money off what you did. Lila frowned. That is not right. No, it is not, he said. I told them no, because what you did was not about money. It was about courage, and I will not let anyone cheapen that. She nodded thoughtfully. Grandma says kindness is not for sale. Your grandmother is a very wise woman, he said, smiling toward her. She has had a lot of practice, the old woman replied with a wink. They talked for hours, the conversation easy, filled with laughter and the smell of cinnamon tea. When it was time to leave, Charles stood by the door, hesitating. There is one more thing I wanted to ask, he said. Would you both come to visit my office someday? Not for business, just to see the view. It is not as nice as your window candle, but it is close. Lila laughed. Can we bring cookies? I insist, he said. The next morning, he arrived at work to find the board still murmuring about public image. He ignored them. Instead, he announced the creation of a new program, not the Miracle Girl Initiative, but a real community fund to support safety training for children and families across the city, named after no one but dedicated to everyone. Courage should not be branded, he told the board. It should be shared. By the end of the week, The first donation went quietly to the community center near Lila's home. No press, no headlines, just a note that read, "For the next brave heart." That evening, when Charles returned to his apartment, he found a small envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a drawing of a tall man, a little girl, and an old woman sitting around a table. Above them, in big letters, it said, "Thank you for being kind." There was no signature, but he knew the handwriting. He smiled, folded the drawing carefully, and placed it in his briefcase. For the first time in years, he looked forward to tomorrow, not because of what he could earn, but because of what he could give. Winter deepened, wrapping the city in a quiet gray hush. Charles Whitman had begun to feel something unfamiliar: stillness. For years, his days had been filled with noise, meetings, endless calls, and deals made in boardrooms where no one truly looked at anyone else. Now, his hours were marked by quieter moments: a shared laugh, the sound of a child's pencil scratching across paper, a voice reminding him to slow down. He still visited Lila and her grandmother often, though never with cameras or gifts of wealth. Sometimes he came simply to listen. That December morning, snow fell softly outside their window, as the three of them sat together sipping cocoa. "It looks like sugar," Lila said, her nose pressed to the cold glass. "Do you ever play in the snow?" Charles asked, smiling. "Not much," she said. "Grandma says I get sick too easily." "Maybe this year will be different," he said. Her grandmother smiled faintly from her chair. "This year already is," she murmured. Lila looked between them, curious but quiet. Charles glanced around the apartment, the small decorations, the warmth that filled the air despite the cracked window pane. He realized he had not felt this kind of comfort in decades. When he returned home later that evening, his penthouse felt enormous and hollow. The city lights stretched endlessly below, but none of them reached his heart. He sat by the window, holding the drawing Lila had sent him, tracing the little crayon figures with his finger. For a long time, he stared at the skyline until memories he had buried for years began to surface. He remembered being a boy himself once, standing in a small kitchen as his mother struggled to pay bills, promising him that hard work would buy safety. He had believed her, and somewhere along the way, he had mistaken wealth for safety and control for strength. Now, a child had taught him that kindness was the real currency that mattered. The next morning, he called an old friend, a former colleague who still managed human resources for his company. "Do we still have the files from the accident 7 years ago? The one involving a security guard named Jenkins?" he asked. There was a pause on the other end. "Yes, I believe so," the voice replied cautiously. "Why?" "Send them to me," Charles said. The file arrived within the hour. He read every page: the reports, the witness statements, the settlement documents. His chest grew heavy. The guard, Lila's father, had died trying to prevent an electrical fire in one of the company's warehouses. The report blamed a contractor for faulty wiring, but buried deep in the paperwork was a memo authorizing budget cuts to the safety inspection team, signed by one of Charles's former executives with Charles's own approval stamped beneath it. He sat in silence, staring at the signature that bound him to a tragedy he had never known he caused. The walls of his office seemed to close in. He picked up his phone, but his hand shook too much to dial. For hours, he sat there, wrestling with a truth that stripped away every defense he had built around his heart. That evening, he went back to see Lila and her grandmother. Snow crunched under his shoes, the air sharp with cold. Lila greeted him at the door, her smile bright as always. "You are early," she said. "We were just starting dinner." He smiled weakly. "I did not come for dinner this time, Lila. I came to talk." Her grandmother looked up from the table, sensing the weight in his voice. "What is wrong?" she asked. He took a deep breath, removing his gloves slowly. "There is something I discovered, something I should have known long ago." He told them about the file, about the accident, about the decisions that had led to it. His voice never rose. It stayed low, steady, almost trembling. When he finished, the room was silent. Lila's eyes were wide, her grandmother's face unreadable. Finally, the old woman spoke. "You did not know," she said quietly, "but now you do." Charles nodded. "And knowing means I cannot stay silent." He reached into his coat pocket and placed an envelope on the table. "This will not bring him back, but it is the first step. I will reopen the case. Make public what was hidden. I will take responsibility." The grandmother looked at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "Money will not fix what broke, Mr. Whitman." "I know," he said softly, "but truth might." Lila reached out, touching his hand. "My dad was brave," she said. "He would have liked you for telling the truth." Tears stung his eyes, but he managed to smile. "Then I hope I can be worthy of that." The old woman's expression softened. "You are learning what real strength looks like. It is not in power or wealth. It is in honesty, even when it hurts." Charles nodded, unable to speak. They sat together as snow fell heavier outside, the street glowing under the pale light. When he finally stood to leave, Lila followed him to the door. "Are you sad?" she asked. "No," he said after a pause. "I think I am finally awake." She smiled and handed him her scarf. "You should wear this. It is cold out." He wrapped it around his neck, the soft fabric carrying the faint scent of home. As he walked back to his car, the snowflakes melted against his skin. For years, he had built his life on foundations of control and silence. Now, truth had shaken it all, and for the first time, he felt lighter. The storm came without warning. One moment, the city was quiet under a curtain of snow, and the next, sirens screamed through the cold night. Charles Whitman was at his office, standing before a room full of lawyers, when his phone buzzed with a single message from Lila's grandmother. It read, "Fire, please help." His heart stopped for a beat. He did not wait for the meeting to end. He grabbed his coat and rushed into the hallway, his footsteps echoing through the empty marble corridor. Outside, the streets were chaos. Flames leaped from the upper floors of the old brick building where Lila lived. Smoke poured into the night sky, thick and black, swallowing the snow as if the city itself were burning. Fire trucks screamed down the street, their lights reflecting off the wet pavement. People shouted, coughing, huddled in the cold as firefighters battled the blaze. Charles's car screeched to a stop, and he ran toward the crowd, ignoring the calls from security to stay back. "Lila!" he shouted, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. A firefighter caught his arm. "Sir, you cannot go in there. There is a little girl and an old woman in that building," Charles yelled. The firefighter turned toward his team. "Unit 3, check the second floor, east side." The men nodded and disappeared into the smoke. Charles could barely see through the haze. He paced near the fire truck, his mind racing. Every second felt like an eternity. The sound of breaking glass echoed above as another window burst from the heat. He could hear the crackle of fire and the distant cries of people praying. Then, from the crowd, a small figure emerged, covered in soot, coughing. "Lila!" he shouted again, and she turned toward his voice. Her face was streaked with ash, her eyes red from the smoke. "Grandma!" she cried. "She is still inside." Charles ran forward, kneeling beside her. "Where?" he asked urgently. "By the stairs." She fell. Her voice broke into sobs. Without thinking, he turned toward the building, but the firefighter grabbed his arm again. "You go in there, you die," the man said sharply. Charles's eyes met his. "Then make sure I do not," he said. And before the firefighter could stop him, he disappeared into the smoke-filled doorway. Inside, the world was fire and shadow. The heat clawed at his skin, the air thick with burning dust. He pulled his coat over his mouth and forced his way through the hallway, calling out, "Mrs. Jenkins." No answer. His lungs burned. He reached the stairwell and saw her collapsed near the wall, her gray hair dusted with ash, her body trembling weakly. He knelt beside her, his voice rough. "It is all right. I am here." Her eyes fluttered open, faint recognition flickering. "Mr. Whitman," she whispered, "I told you you cannot fix everything." "Maybe not," he said, lifting her into his arms, "but I can fix this." He carried her down the stairs, the heat biting at his skin, each step a battle between fear and will. Flames licked the walls, the sound of wood cracking beneath his feet. When he reached the door, strong hands pulled them both out. Firefighters took her from his arms, rushing her toward the ambulance. He stumbled after them, gasping for air, his face streaked with soot. Lila ran toward him, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Grandma!" she cried, clutching her grandmother's hand as the medics worked. Charles knelt beside them, coughing. The old woman's eyes opened weakly. You came back, she whispered. He nodded, unable to speak. She smiled faintly. Good. I knew you would not let the world take her too. Then her hand fell limp. Lila cried out, her voice raw and small, but Charles caught her shoulders gently, holding her close. She is going to rest now, he said softly, his voice shaking. She was brave, just like you. The firefighters worked in silence, the ambulance doors closing slowly. Snow began to fall again, flakes melting into the heat still rising from the ruined building. Lila buried her face against his chest, and he held her tighter, the smell of smoke clinging to them both. For a long moment, he did not move. The world around them blurred into sirens and snow, into grief and gratitude. He had saved lives through money, through power, through influence, but this was different. This was redemption through action. Later, as the fire faded to glowing embers, Charles stood beside the remains of the building, his arms still around Lila. We will find somewhere safe, he said gently. I promise. She looked up at him, her voice small. You already did. He swallowed hard, unable to answer. The fire had taken much, but it had given him something too, a chance to honor the woman who had believed in kindness until her last breath. As dawn approached, the city was quiet again. The flames were gone, replaced by smoke that drifted upward like a prayer. In the middle of the ashes stood a man who had once been lost and a little girl who had once been afraid, holding on to each other as the first light of morning broke through the clouds. The fire had taken almost everything, but it had not taken the bond between them. In the days that followed, the city's cold winter streets seemed quieter, as if mourning with Lila. The building where she and her grandmother had lived was now just a blackened shell. A temporary shelter had taken them in. But it was crowded and loud, filled with people who had lost too much. Charles Whitman could not stand the thought of her staying there. He spent hours on the phone arranging a new place for her, somewhere safe, somewhere warm. 3 days after the fire, a car pulled up to the shelter. Lila sat on a wooden bench, her hands folded tightly around the silver necklace that her grandmother had given her years ago. When she saw Charles step out of the car, she ran toward him. I thought you would not come back, she said softly. He knelt down to her level. Lila, I promised your grandmother I would look after you. I do not break promises anymore. Her eyes filled with tears that she tried to blink away. Grandma said promises are just words, unless you mean them. She was right, he said gently. And I mean this one. He took her hand. Come with me. There is a new place waiting for you. They drove across the city in silence, the streets coated in melting snow, the buildings glistening with frost. When the car stopped, they were in front of a quiet townhouse surrounded by trees. It was simple, but warm. The kind of place where mornings could begin with sunlight instead of worry. Is this really for me? Lila whispered. For us, he said, until you are ready for something bigger. She stepped inside slowly, her shoes squeaking on the wooden floor. There were soft blankets folded on the couch, a kitchen stocked with food, and a small desk by the window with art supplies neatly arranged. You remembered I like to draw, she said, smiling faintly. I remember everything you tell me, he replied. She turned toward him suddenly and wrapped her arms around him. Thank you, Charles. He froze for a moment, surprised, then hugged her back. It had been years since anyone had hugged him without expectation. You do not have to thank me, he said softly. You already gave me something I did not even know I needed. What was that? She asked, a reason to care again. Days turned into weeks. Lila started attending a nearby school, carrying her red backpack that now looked brighter against the snow. Each morning before class, she placed her grandmother's necklace inside her pocket for luck. Charles made it a habit to drive her to school before heading to his office. Their conversations filled the car with warmth stories about her classmates, drawings she was working on, questions about his company. Do you ever get tired of being in charge? She asked one morning. He laughed. Every day. Then why do you do it? Because I thought that was what mattered, he said. But now, I am learning there are other things that matter more. Like what? Like keeping promises, he said, smiling at her reflection in the rearview mirror. After school, she often came to his office. While he finished meetings, She would sit quietly at a small desk near the window, drawing while the city lights flickered below. His employees grew used to seeing her there, her calm presence bringing a strange peace to the otherwise busy office. One afternoon, she handed him a drawing of two figures standing under a tree, holding hands. Above them, in careful letters, she had written, "Family." He looked at it for a long time before whispering, "Thank you, Lila." Life began to fall into a rhythm neither of them had planned, but both had come to need. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Charles found Lila sitting by the window, looking out at the lights. "Do you miss her?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Every day. But Grandma used to say people we love never really leave. They just move into the quiet places of our hearts." He smiled sadly. She was right again. Lila turned to him. "Do you think she would be happy?" "I think she would be proud," he said. She smiled, and the room felt lighter. Later that night, as he tucked her into bed, she reached out and touched the bracelet he still wore on his wrist, the one she had made from string and beads. "You still wear it," she said. "Always," he replied. "It reminds me that life is not about what you have, but who you have." She yawned, her eyes drifting closed. "Grandma said that too." He chuckled softly. "Then your grandmother was the smartest person I have ever met." When she fell asleep, he stood there for a long moment, watching her breathe, the quiet rhythm steady and peaceful. The storm outside had eased. The city glowed faintly under the snow, and for the first time since the fire, Charles felt that maybe healing was possible not through power, not through money, but through the simple act of keeping one child safe. As he turned off the light and stepped into the hallway, he whispered the words that had once saved his life. The words she had taught him to understand fully at last. "Be quiet," he murmured to the empty air, "and be grateful." And in that silence, he finally found peace. Spring came quietly, softening the sharp edges of the city that had been frozen for months. Flowers began to bloom along sidewalks, and children filled the parks again. To anyone looking from the outside, life for Charles Whitman and Lila Jenkins seemed peaceful, even ordinary. But beneath that calm surface, truth had begun to stir. One afternoon, as Charles sat in his office reviewing paperwork, his assistant entered holding a brown envelope. "Sir, this came through internal audit," she said quietly. "It concerns the warehouse accident from years ago." His hands stilled. He had already reopened the investigation, but he was not prepared for what he was about to read. The letter inside was anonymous, typed, and direct. It revealed that the man responsible for hiding the truth about the accident was still working within the company, a senior executive named Robert Kane. He had falsified reports and buried evidence to protect profits, and even after all these years, he continued to cover up unsafe practices. Charles sat in silence, the words burning into his mind. He looked at the framed drawing Lila had made for him on the wall, the one that said, "Family." He thought of her father, a man who had died doing his job while people like Kane grew rich from his silence. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. That evening, when he picked Lila up from school, she noticed his quietness. "Are you mad?" she asked as she buckled her seatbelt. "No," he said softly. "Just thinking." "About work?" He nodded. "About right and wrong." She tilted her head, studying him. "Grandma used to say wrong things grow like weeds if no one pulls them out." Her words hit him like truth disguised in innocence. "Then I guess it is time to do some gardening," he said with a faint smile. That night, long after Lila had gone to bed, Charles drafted a letter to the board of directors. In it, he confessed that his company had failed in its duty to protect its workers, that decisions made under his leadership had cost a man his life, and that justice demanded accountability. He attached the evidence from the audit and signed his name at the bottom without hesitation. When he finished, he looked out the window at the dark skyline. The lights below glimmered like scattered stars, and for the first time, he did not feel above them. He felt part of them. The next morning, news broke that Whitman Industries would face a full federal review. Reporters gathered outside the headquarters again, but this time the story was not about a billionaire's redemption. It was about truth. Inside the office, tension filled the air. Executives whispered as Charles walked into the meeting room, calm and composed. Robert Kane was there, his face pale. "You cannot do this," Kane hissed. "You will destroy everything we built." "Everything you built was on a lie," Charles said evenly. "And lies eventually collapse," the man sneered. "You will ruin yourself for a dead man." Charles's voice stayed soft, but his eyes were steady. "I am doing this for the living his daughter." The room fell silent. He turned to the others. "If we built something worth saving, it will survive the truth. If not, it deserves to fall." Later that day, when he picked up Lila from school, she climbed into the car holding a piece of paper. "We wrote essays today," she said. "Mine was about heroes." "And who did you write about?" he asked, smiling. "About Grandma," she said proudly. "And maybe a little about you," he laughed softly. "A little? Just a little," she said. "You are still learning." Her teasing made him laugh harder than he had in weeks. But later that night, when he tucked her in, she looked at him seriously. "Are you sad again?" she asked. He hesitated. "A little, but it is a good kind of sad. The kind that means something is changing." "Like when winter turns into spring," she said. "Exactly like that." She reached for his hand. "Grandma said truth hurts before it heals." He squeezed her hand gently. "Your grandmother was the wisest woman I ever met." "I know," Lila said, smiling sleepily. "That is why I listen to her even when she is not here." He stayed beside her until her breathing slowed into the rhythm of dreams. Outside, rain began to fall softly, washing the streets clean. The next morning, as headlines filled the papers about the investigation and the company's confession, Charles did not hide. He stood before the cameras and told the truth. He admitted his mistakes, named those who had covered them up, and promised reform not as a leader protecting his image, but as a man keeping a promise to a child. When he returned home that evening, Lila ran to him with a drawing in her hand. It showed a man standing in the rain, holding an umbrella over a little girl. Above them were the words, "Doing the right thing, even when it rains." He knelt and hugged her tightly, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for reminding me who I am supposed to be." That night, as the city lights shimmered through the gentle drizzle, Charles sat by the window, watching reflections ripple across the glass. The world outside might judge him for what he had done, but for the first time, he did not feel afraid. Truth, like rain, had a way of cleansing what had been buried too long. And somewhere in the next room, a little girl slept soundly, her heart safe, her belief in kindness unbroken. The days that followed were heavy with consequence. The confession that Charles Whitman had made to the world shook his company to its core. For years, people had seen him as untouchable, a man whose name symbolized power and perfection. Now, they saw something else: flaws, remorse, and an unexpected humanity. News anchors debated his motives. Employees whispered in hallways. Investors panicked, but Charles did not hide. Every morning he walked through the glass doors of his building, greeted his staff with calm eyes, and went straight to work. The office had grown quieter since his announcement, but in that silence, something new began to grow respect. For the first time, people spoke to him without fear, not as a distant figure but as a man who had dared to tell the truth. At home, life continued with its own rhythm. Lila adjusted to her new school, making friends, learning piano, and drawing almost every evening. Sometimes she would wait for him by the window with a mug of hot cocoa ready, and they would talk about small things: the smell of spring rain, the sound of laughter from her classmates, or the way the city lights looked from her room. Those moments grounded him more than anything else. Yet beneath the calm, Charles knew there was still unfinished business. One afternoon, he called an emergency meeting at the company headquarters. The boardroom was tense as he stood before them. "We cannot undo the past," he began, his voice steady, "but we can choose what kind of company we become now." One of the senior executives cleared his throat. "Sir, you have already done enough. Public opinion is shifting, but the investors—" "This is not about investors," Charles interrupted. "This is about integrity." He paused, looking around the room. "For too long, we have built walls between ourselves and the people who make this company possible. Workers, families, lives, we treated them like numbers on paper. That ends today." He took out a folder and placed it on the table. "I am establishing a fund in honor of Henry Jenkins, the man who died in that warehouse. It will provide support and education for workers and their families, not just here, but in every branch of this company." The room fell silent. "Sir," one of them said, "this will cost millions." "Then let it cost millions," he replied firmly. "No amount of money compares to the cost of silence." His words carried through the room like a quiet storm. No one argued. When the meeting ended, he stepped outside and looked up at the sky. The clouds were parting, revealing patches of blue. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again. That evening, when he returned home, Lila was sitting at the kitchen table, working on a small science project. The smell of cookies filled the air. She looked up and grinned. "You are late," she said. "I had to tell a few people some hard truths," he said, smiling back. "Did they listen?" "I think they did." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Grandma used to say truth is like rain. It falls whether people want it or not." He chuckled softly. She was right. Lila looked at him carefully. "You look lighter," she said, "like something heavy fell off you." "Maybe it did," he said, taking a seat beside her. "Maybe I finally let go of everything that did not matter." She showed him her project, a small model of the solar system made from colored foam balls and string. "See this one?" she said, pointing to the smallest ball painted blue. "That is Earth. It is tiny, but Grandma said even small things can change the whole universe." He looked at her, and for a moment he saw her father's courage, her grandmother's strength, and her own bright spirit reflected back at him. "You already changed mine," he said softly. "You know that, right?" She smiled shyly and went back to painting. That night, as the city lights shimmered outside, Charles sat by the window with a notebook in his hands. He began to write not contracts or statements, but a letter. It was addressed to Lila. In it, he wrote about what she had taught him, that compassion was stronger than fear, that honesty was the only path to peace, and that forgiveness was not weakness but freedom. He promised her that as long as he lived, his company and his heart would belong to people, not power. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, intending to give it to her when she was older. In the quiet that followed, he thought about Henry Jenkins again, the man whose death had started everything. "I hope you can see her," he whispered. "Your daughter saved me. She made me who I should have been." The next morning, he announced his decision to step down as CEO and become chairman of the new foundation in Henry Jenkins's name. Cameras flashed, questions flew, but his voice remained calm as he said, "Leadership is not about control. It is about responsibility." That evening, when he picked Lila up from school, she climbed into the car and smiled. "Did you fix the company?" she asked. He looked at her and shook his head gently. "No, Lila. I fixed myself." She grinned. "Grandma would say that is harder." "She would be right again," he said, laughing softly. The sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across the road as they drove home. The bracelet she had made for him caught the last light of the day, glinting gold and silver. For Charles, that small reflection was enough a reminder that even the smallest hands could guide the largest hearts toward the truth. By the time spring turned to summer, the story of Charles Whitman's confession and his foundation had spread far beyond the city. News outlets called it the redemption of a billionaire. But to him, it was never about redemption, it was about truth. The foundation had begun funding safety programs, scholarships, and small clinics in poor neighborhoods. People started writing letters, hundreds of them, from families who had once worked for his company, from students who had received aid, from people who simply wanted to say thank you. Yet the letter that meant the most came from the school Lila attended. It was short, handwritten, and sealed with a red sticker that said, "Thank you." Inside was a note from the principal inviting him to an assembly where one of the students would receive an award for bravery. He smiled when he read it. "I think I know who that is," he murmured. On the morning of the ceremony, he picked Lila up from school as usual, but she was unusually quiet. "You look nervous," he said gently. She looked out the window. "They said they are giving me something today, but I do not want to go on stage. I do not like when people look at me." "Then just look for me," he said. "I will be there." The school gym was filled with parents, teachers, and students sitting in rows of folding chairs. The sound of chatter and squeaking sneakers echoed through the large room. When the principal stepped to the microphone, everyone quieted. "Today," she began, "we honor a young student whose courage reminds us that bravery does not come from strength or age, but from compassion." Lila shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "This student risked her life to save another person," the principal continued, "and by doing so, she reminded our city what it means to care for one another. Please welcome Miss Lila Jenkins." The crowd erupted in applause. Charles watched as she walked slowly to the stage, her small hands clutching the edges of her dress. She looked out at the crowd, eyes wide, searching until she found him in the back row. He smiled and nodded. She took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. Her voice trembled at first, but then it steadied. "I did not save anyone alone," she said. "I just did what my grandma taught me. She said if you see someone who needs help, you do not wait for someone else to move, you move." Her words silenced the crowd. She looked down for a moment, then continued, "The man I helped saved me too. He showed me that people can change and that kindness does not stop, it grows." Tears blurred Charles's vision as he listened. The principal handed Lila a small medal and a framed certificate. The students clapped again, louder this time, and even the teachers wiped their eyes. After the ceremony, reporters approached the principal, asking for interviews, but Lila shook her head. "I do not want to talk to cameras," she said softly. "I just want to go home." Outside, the afternoon sun shimmered on the pavement. Charles walked beside her quietly. "You were brave up there," he said. "I just said the truth," she replied. "That is what you told me to do," he smiled. "Then you are a better teacher than I am." They stopped near the car, and she looked up at him. "Did it feel like that when you told the truth about your company?" "Yes," he said. "It was scary at first, but after, it felt like breathing again." She nodded. "That is how it felt today." That evening, after dinner, Lila placed her medal on the kitchen counter beside the framed drawing of her grandmother. "She would have been proud," Charles said softly. "Do you think she saw me?" "I think she never stopped watching you," he said. Later that night, when she was asleep, he sat by the window with a cup of tea. The moonlight spilled across the room, illuminating the medal, the drawing, and the small bracelet on his wrist. He thought about how far they had come from the chaos of that day in the lobby to this quiet peace. His phone buzzed with a message from one of the board members. "The press wants a statement about the ceremony. Should we respond?" He looked at the message, then deleted it without replying. This moment was not for headlines. It was for her. The next morning, photos from the ceremony appeared online anyway, shared by parents and teachers. The picture showed Lila standing on stage with her medal, her small figure framed by sunlight through the gym windows. The caption read, "The girl who reminded us to be kind." By afternoon, the story had spread, and messages of admiration poured in again. But Lila did not know. When he picked her up from school, she was humming softly, holding a sketchbook under her arm. "What are you drawing now?" he asked. "Something for Grandma," she said. "And maybe for you. Can I see it?" "Not yet," she said with a secretive smile. "You have to wait." He laughed. "All right, I can wait." As they drove home, the radio played softly in the background, a news anchor talking about change, hope, and the power of compassion. Charles turned the volume down and looked at Lila through the mirror. "You know," he said, "you changed more than just my life. You changed the whole city." She grinned. "Grandma says when you light one candle, you do not know how many more it will light after." He nodded, his heart full. The sun dipped below the skyline, casting the city in gold. Somewhere behind them, a headline flashed across a television screen, but neither of them saw it. They were too busy laughing about what kind of cookies to bake that weekend. Their world small, simple, and full of warmth, the way it was always meant to be. Summer melted into fall, and the city glowed with the soft amber of changing leaves. Life had settled into a quiet rhythm for Charles Whitman and Lila Jenkins. Their small home was filled with warmth, the smell of baked bread, and the sound of piano practice that drifted through the rooms. Each morning began with laughter and ended with stories. Charles had found peace in simplicity, something he had never known before. But peace, he was learning, did not mean life would stop testing him. One crisp afternoon, as golden leaves swirled across the street, a black car pulled up in front of the house. A man in a gray suit stepped out and knocked on the door. Charles opened it, surprised to see one of his former board members. "Robert," he said cautiously. "It has been a while." The man smiled thinly. "Charles, may I come in?" Lila was in the living room drawing quietly, so Charles stepped outside instead. "What do you want?" he asked. "I thought we had made everything clear when I stepped down." Robert's smile faded. "You may have stepped down, but your decisions continue to affect the company. The new leadership is struggling. Investors are leaving. They say your foundation drained resources that should have been used for growth." "Growth?" Charles said sharply. "You mean profit." "You are destroying your legacy," Robert said coldly. "You could come back, fix it, restore what we built." Charles looked past him at the street, where Lila's laughter floated through the open window. "I do not need to restore anything," he said quietly. "I already fixed what mattered." Robert's jaw tightened. "You traded power for sentiment. One day, you will regret that." "No," Charles said. "I regret the years I spent believing that power was worth more than people." He turned toward the door, ending the conversation. "Goodbye, Robert." As the car drove away, he stood for a moment, watching the leaves drift down the street. Inside, Lila looked up from her drawing. "Was that someone from your work?" she asked. "Just a ghost from an old life," he said. "Do ghosts talk?" she asked, tilting her head. "Sometimes," he said, "but I do not listen anymore." The next few days passed quietly, but Robert's words lingered in his mind. Late at night, he would sit by the window, wondering if he had done enough, if the world would forget the good he tried to build. One evening, he found Lila sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of books around her. "What are you working on?" he asked. "A project," she said proudly. "We are supposed to write about someone who changed the world." "Who did you pick?" he asked, smiling. "You," she said simply. He blinked, taken aback. "Me?" "Yes," she said. "You changed my world, so that counts." He laughed softly, touched beyond words. "That is very kind, Lila. Grandma used to say the world is not a big place. It is just a lot of small hearts connected," she added. He reached over and tousled her hair gently. She was right again. The next morning, Charles received an invitation in the mail. It was from the city council, inviting him to attend a ceremony honoring the foundation's work. He hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to step back into that world of cameras and attention. But when he showed Lila the letter, her eyes lit up. "We should go," she said. "Grandma always said when good things happen, you share them." So he agreed. On the night of the event, the city hall shimmered under bright lights. Reporters gathered outside, and the air buzzed with chatter. Lila wore a simple white dress with a red ribbon in her hair. She clutched his hand tightly as they stepped out of the car. "Do I have to talk?" she whispered. "Only if you want to," he said with a smile. Inside, people applauded as they entered. The mayor spoke first, recounting how the foundation had transformed lives across the city. Then he turned to Charles. "We honor you tonight, not just for what you built, but for what you restored faith and compassion." The applause rose again, but Charles's eyes were on Lila, who smiled proudly from her seat. When he stepped to the microphone, his voice was steady and warm. "I accept this, not for myself, but for a little girl who reminded me what it means to be alive. I was a man who had everything but could not breathe. She taught me that kindness is air that without it, no one survives." The room fell silent, his words heavy and true. "This foundation," he continued, "belongs to every person who chooses compassion over comfort. It began with a child's courage, and it will live because of the courage of others." When he finished, the crowd rose to its feet. Cameras flashed, but he barely noticed. He walked back to his seat, where Lila threw her arms around him. "You sounded just like Grandma," she said. "Then I must be doing something right," he said with a laugh. As they left the building, the night sky was filled with stars. Lila pointed upward. "Grandma used to say stars are the stories people leave behind. Maybe she has one up there now." "Maybe she does," he said softly. "And maybe tonight, she is smiling." They walked home together under the starlight. the air cool and sweet, carrying the promise of everything they had lost and everything they had found again. For the first time in years, Charles did not think about legacy, power, or wealth. He thought only of the small hand in his, the laughter beside him, and the quiet certainty that kindness had written them both into the stars. The weeks after the ceremony passed with a gentle calm. Autumn deepened, the leaves falling like golden rain around the townhouse that had become their safe place. The world outside still spoke about Charles Whitman and the little girl who changed him, but inside that house, life was beautifully simple. Lila went to school every morning with her red backpack and her hair tied in 2 neat braids. In the evenings, she practiced piano or painted while Charles cooked dinner, the scent of roasted vegetables and warm bread filling the air. He had never imagined he would find peace in such ordinary things. But one gray afternoon, as the wind carried the chill of early winter, Charles received a letter that would stir the quiet world they had built. It was from a law firm in Chicago. He opened it slowly, his fingers trembling slightly as he read the words. The letter explained that an old insurance policy from the company's past had been discovered, one that named Henry Jenkins, Lila's father, as a beneficiary for an amount never claimed. With interest and adjustments, it had grown into a significant sum. The letter stated that the funds would be transferred to the next of kin. Charles read it twice, hardly believing it. It was as if the universe had decided, in its own way, to give something back to the little girl who had given him everything. That evening, when Lila came home, he sat her down at the kitchen table. "Lila," he began gently, "there is something important I need to tell you." She looked up from her homework. "Am I in trouble?" "No," he said with a small smile. "Quite the opposite." He handed her the letter. She scanned it carefully, her brow furrowed. "I do not understand. What does this mean?" "It means your father left something behind for you," he said softly. "Something no one knew about until now." She looked at him with wide eyes. "But my dad is gone." "Yes," he said, his voice low. "But this is part of him still taking care of you." For a long moment, she was silent. Then tears filled her eyes. "He did not forget me." "He never could," Charles said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "And now, you will have something for your future. For school, for your dreams." She wiped her tears and nodded. "Can I still stay here?" He laughed gently. "Of course you can. This is your home for as long as you want it to be." The next morning, Charles took her to the foundation office to meet the lawyers handling the paperwork. As they sat across the large conference table, Lila swung her legs nervously under the chair. "Do I have to sign anything?" she whispered. "Not yet," he said. "I will take care of the details for now." When the meeting ended, one of the lawyers smiled at her. "Your father would be very proud," he said kindly. Lila smiled shyly. "He already is," she said. On the drive home, she looked out the window, her voice quiet. "Charles, can I do something with the money?" "It is yours, Lila," he said. "You can do whatever you wish." She hesitated, then said, "I want to give some of it to other kids who do not have a home, like the shelter where we stayed before. They helped Grandma and me when we had nowhere to go." His throat tightened. "That is very kind of you. Grandma used to say if you hold too much light, it starts to burn your hands," she added. "You have to share it. Your grandmother," he said softly, "was the wisest woman I have ever known." That night, after dinner, she drew something on a large sheet of paper. It was a picture of her father standing under a tree with her grandmother beside him, both of them smiling. Above them, she had written, "Still watching over me." She placed it on the mantel beside the candle that always burned in their memory. Charles watched her as she stepped back, her small frame outlined by the soft glow of light. "They would be proud," he said. "I think so too," she whispered. Later that night, after she had gone to bed, Charles sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. For the first time in his life, he felt like everything was where it should be, not perfect, not without pain, but balanced in a way that made sense. He thought of Henry Jenkins, the man whose courage had once gone unnoticed, and of the girl who had carried that same courage into his life. "You left her the world," he murmured, "and she gave it back to all of us." As he turned off the light and walked down the hallway, he stopped at Lila's door. She was asleep, her small hand resting on the silver necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. The candle on the mantel flickered faintly, casting soft shadows on the wall, and for a fleeting moment, he could almost feel that the woman and the man in the drawing were there too, standing quietly in the warmth of the home their love had built. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, silent and steady, blanketing the world in peace. Inside, Charles whispered a promise into the stillness of the night. "I will protect her, always." And for the first time, he knew he already had. Winter settled deep over the city, bringing with it long nights and quiet mornings. Inside the townhouse, warmth lingered like a heartbeat, and laughter had become a daily sound. Lila was growing quickly, her hair now reaching her shoulders, her voice stronger, her questions endless. She had begun to take piano lessons at a small community center funded by the foundation. Every evening she practiced, her fingers uncertain, but her determination steady. Charles would sit nearby, reading reports or simply listening, the music filling spaces that once echoed with silence. But beneath the gentle rhythm of their days, something began to change. Charles had started feeling tired, more than usual. At first, he dismissed it as age or stress, but the dizziness came often now, and the headaches followed like shadows. He told no one, not even Lila. He did not want to worry her. He had promised to protect her, not to add another burden to her young heart. One cold morning, as he walked her to school, she looked up at him and said, "You look pale." He smiled weakly. "Just not enough sleep, Lila." She frowned. "Grandma used to say sleep cannot fix everything." He laughed softly. "Your grandmother had a saying for everything." That afternoon, while she was at school, he visited the doctor. The office smelled of antiseptic and faint coffee. The doctor reviewed the tests quietly, his expression serious but gentle. "Mr. Whitman," he said finally, "you have a heart condition that requires attention. It is not immediate danger, but you will need surgery soon." The word surgery echoed in his head. "How long do I have if I do nothing?" he asked. "It depends," the doctor said carefully. "Months, perhaps a year, maybe less, but with treatment, you have a real chance." Charles nodded, numb. "I will think about it," he said. That night, as snow fell softly against the windows, he watched Lila play the piano. Her small fingers moved clumsily over the keys, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she missed a note, she giggled. "I will get it right next time," she said confidently. He smiled. "I am sure you will." He wanted to tell her everything, but something inside him stopped the words. She had lost enough already. He would not let fear take away her joy. Instead, he decided quietly that he would prepare for whatever came. Over the next weeks, he began writing letters, one for every birthday she had yet to reach. Each letter carried words of love, advice, and stories she could hold on to, no matter what happened. He sealed them carefully, labeling them by year. Lila noticed his late nights and asked once, "Why do you stay up so long?" "I am working on a surprise," he said with a smile. "For me? For you," he promised. One evening as they sat by the fireplace, she asked him to tell her a story. A true one, she insisted. So he told her about his mother, about growing up poor, about building a company and losing himself in it. He told her how one day, a little girl had saved him not just with her hands, but with her heart. She listened silently, her chin resting on her knees. "That girl sounds smart," she said at last. "She was," he said softly, "and brave. Do you think she knows how much she changed you?" "I hope she does," he said, looking at her with a smile that carried both pride and sorrow. The next morning, he received another letter from the hospital reminding him to schedule the operation. He folded it neatly and placed it in his desk drawer beside the letters he had written for her. He would go soon, he told himself, after the holidays. For now, he wanted only peace. The first snow of December arrived early that year. Lila ran outside with her mittens and red scarf, spinning under the falling flakes. "Come on," she called, laughing. He stepped out to join her, his breath visible in the cold air. She threw a snowball that hit his shoulder, and he laughed harder than he had in months. "You are getting strong," he said. "That is because you feed me too much," she teased. They built a small snowman together, crooked but smiling, and when they finished, she placed her grandmother's old hat on its head. "Now he looks perfect," she declared. He nodded. Just like this day. That night, after she had gone to bed, Charles stood by the window, watching the snow cover the city like a blanket. His chest ached slightly, but it was not pain that scared him, it was the thought of leaving her unprotected. He whispered into the quiet, "Please, let me stay long enough to see her grow." Somewhere deep inside, he knew time was not infinite, but he also knew something stronger than time had already taken root in both of them. The love that began with a single act of kindness had become its own kind of heartbeat, one that would keep echoing long after his own had faded. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, like grace. The new year came quietly, with soft snow melting on rooftops and lights still hanging in windows from the holidays. Lila was full of excitement, her days now filled with piano recitals, school projects, and drawings that decorated every wall of the house. Charles watched her grow with a quiet awe that filled his heart with both pride and fear. Each day he felt his strength slipping little by little, like sand through an hourglass, but he hid it behind a smile. He had learned long ago that love sometimes meant protecting others from worry. One morning, while she practiced a simple song on the piano, he sat nearby, his breathing shallow. The melody stumbled once, and she looked over her shoulder. "You are not listening," she said playfully. "I am," he whispered. "I am listening with my whole heart." She smiled and went back to playing, her small fingers pressing each key with careful grace. That afternoon, a letter arrived from the hospital reminding him again about the surgery. He held it for a long moment, then placed it beside the letters he had written for her in the drawer. He promised himself he would schedule it soon, but not yet. There were still things he wanted to do, still promises to keep. One cold Sunday, he took her to the park near the river where they used to walk in the early days after her grandmother passed. The trees stood bare, their branches stretching toward the gray sky. Ducks floated lazily across the half-frozen water. "It looks like glass," Lila said, pointing at the river. "It is beautiful, but dangerous," he replied. "That is what Grandma used to say about life too," she added. "Beautiful, but dangerous." They sat on a bench, sharing hot chocolate from a paper cup. For a while, neither spoke. Then she turned to him and said, "When I grow up, I want to help people like Grandma and you did." He smiled softly. "You already do." She shook her head. "Not enough. I want to be a doctor, like the ones who helped Grandma when she was sick." His throat tightened. "That is a big dream, Lila." "Grandma said dreams are only big until you reach them," she said. "Then you just make new ones." He nodded, his voice quiet. She was right, as always. As they walked home, the sky began to glow with the first hints of sunset, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. Lila ran ahead, her laughter ringing through the air. He watched her, his chest aching not from illness, but from love too large to contain. That night, as she slept, he sat at his desk, writing in his notebook. It was not another letter this time. It was a will, written in his own hand, leaving everything, his home, his savings, the foundation's shares, to her. He added one line at the end. "For Lila Jenkins, the girl who saved my life and taught me how to live it." The next morning, he woke feeling weaker than before. The world seemed heavier, slower. As he tried to make breakfast, his hand trembled, and the cup slipped from his grasp, shattering on the floor. The sound brought Lila running. "Charles," she gasped, kneeling beside him as he leaned against the counter. "I am all right," he said, forcing a smile. "Just clumsy." "You are not all right," she said firmly. "You need to rest." He looked at her, and for the first time, he saw in her eyes not just innocence but strength, the same steady courage her father must have had. "Okay," he said softly. "I will rest." She helped him to the couch, her small hands surprisingly steady. He lay back, breathing deeply as she fetched him a blanket. When she returned, she tucked it around him carefully, the way her grandmother used to. "You are bossy, you know that?" he teased weakly. "Grandma said kindness can sound bossy when you care too much," she replied with a small smile. He chuckled softly. "Then you care a lot." She nodded, sitting beside him. "Always." That evening, as she practiced piano, he closed his eyes, listening to the melody float through the room. The notes were imperfect, hesitant, but beautiful in their sincerity. When she finished, she whispered, "Was that better?" "It was perfect," he said, his voice faint but full of warmth. She looked over, her brow furrowed. "Charles?" His eyes opened slowly. "Yes, Lila. Do you promise you will be okay?" He hesitated, then said softly, "I promise that I will always be here, one way or another." She frowned. "That is not an answer." He smiled faintly. "It is the best one I have." Later that night, when she was asleep, he took out the hospital letter again. This time, he signed the form. He folded it, placed it in an envelope, and set it by the door for morning mail. As he looked around the house, the photos, the drawings, the quiet piano, he felt peace. The fear that had haunted him for months was gone. Whatever came next, he knew she would be all right, because she carried her grandmother's wisdom, her father's courage, and something more, his heart. The snow fell softly outside, and he whispered into the stillness, "Be quiet and live." It was the same phrase that had once saved him, now a blessing passed on to her, and as the wind sighed through the trees, the house seemed to breathe with him, steady, alive, and full of love. The morning Charles Whitman finally went to the hospital was quiet and cold. The air outside was sharp, and frost clung to the edges of car windows. Lila stood beside him at the door, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes full of worry. "Do you have to go today?" she asked softly. He knelt to tie her scarf, his hands trembling slightly. "Yes," he said gently. "It is time." "Will they fix your heart?" she asked. He smiled, the lines around his eyes soft. "They will try, sweetheart, and I will do my best to let them." She hesitated, then wrapped her arms around him. "Then promise you will come back." He held her tightly. "I promise I will always find my way back to you." A car from the foundation came to pick him up, driven by a nurse from the hospital. As it pulled away, Lila stood in the doorway, watching until it turned the corner. The house felt too big without him. Even the ticking of the clock seemed louder. At school that day, she could not concentrate. Her teacher noticed her staring out the window and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He will be all right," the teacher whispered. Lila nodded, but her chest felt heavy. That evening, she sat by the piano, trying to play, but her fingers shook too much. Finally, she whispered to the empty room, "Please, let him come home." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Charles lay in a white room with the hum of machines around him. The doctor explained the procedure one more time, but his thoughts drifted. He was thinking of the day in the lobby years ago when a little girl had saved his life. He remembered her small hands pressing against his chest, her trembling voice saying, "Be quiet, sir." That voice had never left him. As they prepared him for surgery, he felt calm. Fear had no place left in him, only gratitude remained. "Are you ready?" the surgeon asked. "Yes," he said, closing his eyes. "I am ready." The lights above blurred into one bright glow, and then the world faded. Back at home, hours passed like days for Lila. She sat by the window with her grandmother's candle burning softly beside her. The flame flickered, small but steady, casting long shadows on the wall. She whispered again, "Come home, Charles." The phone rang just before dawn. Lila rushed to answer, her voice trembling. It was the nurse. "He made it through the surgery," she said gently. "He is resting now. He asked for you." Relief flooded through Lila so fast she could hardly speak. "Can I see him?" she asked. "Tomorrow," the nurse said. "He needs rest tonight." The next morning, she dressed early and insisted on bringing his favorite book and the drawing she had made of them both standing by the river. When she entered the hospital room, Charles was awake, pale but smiling. "There you are," he said softly. "I told you I would find my way back." She ran to his side and held his hand carefully. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You kept yours first," he said. "You never stopped believing." She smiled through her tears. "I was scared. I was too," he admitted. "But every time I closed my eyes, I saw your face, and I thought if I can make it back to her, then it is worth it." For the next few days, she stayed by his side, reading aloud from the book she had brought. Sometimes he would fall asleep while she read, the soft rhythm of her voice mixing with the steady beeping of the machines. The nurses adored her. "You are his good luck charm," one said. "He gets better every time you are here." Lila grinned. That is because I am very bossy. The nurse laughed. That must be it. On the 5th day, the doctor entered with a smile. Mr. Whitman, your heart is strong. You will need rest, but you will make a full recovery. Charles looked at Lila and whispered, looks like we both get a second chance again. When he finally returned home, the house smelled of cinnamon and fresh flowers. Lila had baked him cookies that were slightly burnt but filled with love. You did all this for me? He asked. You did a lot more for me, she said proudly. He sat in his chair by the window, the candle flickering nearby, and for the first time in months, he felt truly alive. You know, he said, your grandmother would be proud of you. Lila smiled. I think she already is. The days turned peaceful again, filled with music, laughter, and the sound of two lives intertwined by fate and love. Sometimes, when Lila practiced piano, he would close his eyes and listen. Each note reminded him of how fragile and beautiful life was, like snow melting in sunlight, like a whisper that could save a heart. And every night, before she went to bed, Lila would peek into his room and say the same words she had said years ago when she saved him the first time. Be quiet, sir. And every night, Charles would smile and whisper back, thank you for teaching me how. Outside, the winter slowly faded, but inside their little home, warmth bloomed again, proof that love, real love, never left. It simply grew stronger with every second chance it was given. Spring returned to the city with gentle rain and streets lined with cherry blossoms. The air carried the scent of renewal, of beginnings that felt familiar but new. Inside the small townhouse, laughter had returned like sunlight through the curtains. Charles Whitman was healing well, his steps slower but steadier each day. The scar from his surgery was a quiet reminder of how close he had come to losing everything, but also how much he had gained in the process. Lila Jenkins, now taller and more confident, filled the house with energy. Every morning, she played a new tune on the piano, her music clumsy but full of heart. She had started volunteering at the local clinic after school, sweeping floors, handing out bandages, and chatting with patients. I am practicing, she said proudly when Charles asked why she spent so much time there. Practicing what? He teased. Practicing being a doctor, she said, so I can help people the way they helped you. He smiled, watching her tie her shoelaces in a hurry. You already help people, Lila. You help me every day. That is different, she said seriously. You are family. Those words warmed something deep in his chest. For so long, he had been surrounded by people who used titles and positions to define worth. Now, a little girl with braids and a red backpack had given him the one title that mattered most: family. One bright afternoon, they walked together to the park near the river. The trees were covered in blossoms, their petals floating like tiny pink clouds. Lila ran ahead, chasing the falling petals, while Charles sat on their favorite bench, the same one they had shared during the long winter months before his surgery. When she returned, her hands were full of flowers. For Grandma, she said, placing them gently on the water's edge. She would like these. Charles nodded, his voice soft. She would love them, and she would be proud of you. Do you think she can see us? She asked. I think she never stopped watching, he said. They stood in silence, the sound of the river mixing with the rustle of leaves. Then Lila looked up at him and said, Charles, what do you think heaven is like? He smiled faintly. Maybe it is like this, quiet, kind, full of second chances. She nodded, thoughtful. Then Grandma must be happy there. I am sure she is, he said, especially knowing you are happy here. That night, they cooked dinner together. Lila insisted on making soup, though she accidentally added too much salt. It tastes funny, she admitted, wrinkling her nose. It tastes like effort, Charles said with a grin. And effort is good, she laughed. You will eat anything I make, won't you? Everything except burnt cookies, he teased. That was one time, she said, pretending to be offended. After dinner, she worked on a school project about heroes. Who are you writing about? He asked. You, she said, not looking up. You are my hero. His heart tightened. Lila, I do not think I am the kind of person they mean when they say hero. She smiled. That is what makes you one. Later that evening, when she went to bed, he sat by the window, the same spot where he had spent so many nights reflecting on his life. The candle still burned on the mantel, next to the drawing she had made of her father and grandmother. He thought about how far they had come, the near death, the loss, the fire, the truth, and the healing. Every chapter had led to this, quiet joy, but he also knew that time never stood still. The next day, a letter arrived from the foundation inviting him to speak at a conference about ethics in business. It was to be held at the university where Lila's father had once studied. He read it slowly, realizing what it meant. He would be returning to the place where everything had begun: the company, the ambition, the fall, and the redemption. That evening, he showed the letter to Lila. "Do you think I should go?" he asked. She looked up at him, eyes bright. "If they want you to tell the truth, then yes. Grandma said truth never gets old." He chuckled. "You always know what to say." "That is because I listened to you," she said proudly. He shook his head. "No, Lila. You have been the one teaching me all along." The next week, they traveled together. It was a short trip, but to both of them, it felt like a journey into their past. The university auditorium was filled with students, professors, and business leaders. When Charles stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell silent. Lila sat in the front row, her little hands folded neatly on her lap. He spoke not about profits or power, but about people. "The greatest investment I ever made was not in a company," he said. "It was in a single act of kindness, a child who chose to help a stranger instead of walking away." The audience listened in stillness. "We build our lives on what we think matters," he continued. "But in the end, it is not the buildings or the money or the titles. It is the hearts we touch." When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Lila stood, clapping louder than anyone. Afterward, as they walked out into the sunlight, she looked up at him and said, "Grandma would say you did good." He laughed softly. "Then I guess I did." She reached for his hand, and together they walked through the blooming campus, two lives intertwined by fate, kindness, and the quiet power of truth. For the first time in years, Charles felt something he had not felt even in his youth: complete. Not because of success, but because of love that had come full circle. Years passed quietly after that conference, the seasons folding one into another like pages in a book that had learned to rest between chapters. The city grew brighter, the foundation expanded, and Lila Jenkins blossomed into a young woman with the same steady heart that had once saved a man's life. Charles Whitman aged with grace, his hair silvering, his steps slower, but his spirit still carrying the same light that little girl had once reignited. They still lived in the same townhouse by the river, though the walls now carried more photographs, each one capturing moments of laughter, birthdays, and quiet evenings at the piano. Lila's drawings had turned to paintings, her childish strokes replaced by graceful confidence. But one painting remained framed above the mantel, the one of her father and grandmother beneath a tree. It was the first picture she had ever drawn for them, and Charles had always insisted it stay right there, at the heart of their home. One late afternoon, the sky blushed orange as the sun began to dip below the city skyline. Lila sat by the window, a notebook open on her lap, studying for her college entrance exams. "You are very quiet," Charles said softly from his armchair. "That means I am concentrating," she teased without looking up. "I see," he said with a smile. "When I was your age, quiet usually meant trouble." "That is because you were probably the one causing it," she replied, grinning. He chuckled. "You are not wrong." A few moments later, she set her notebook aside and said, "I was thinking, when I finish school, I want to travel. Maybe volunteer somewhere that needs doctors." "That sounds like a beautiful idea," he said. "You have always been a healer, Lila. You just did not know it yet." She smiled. "I learned from the best." His eyes softened. "You mean your grandmother?" "I mean you," she said quietly. "You saved me too, you know." He shook his head gently. "No, sweetheart, you saved me first." As evening settled in, she began to play the piano, the same melody she had learned as a little girl. The notes were fuller now, steady and sure. He closed his eyes, letting the sound fill the room. "It sounds different now," he murmured. "Better?" she asked. "Wiser?" he said with a small smile. The candle on the mantel flickered beside the old drawing, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Lila finished the song and turned to him, noticing that he had grown quiet. "Charles," she said softly. His eyes opened slowly, and he smiled. "I was just thinking how proud I am of you." "Do not start saying goodbye." she said with a playful frown. I am not going anywhere. Neither am I, he replied. Not really. That night, after she went to bed, he sat by the window once more, looking out at the lights reflecting on the river. He could hear her faintly humming from her room, the same tune she had played on the piano. He placed his hand over his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his fingers. It was slower than before, but it was enough. He whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, Lila." The next morning, sunlight streamed into the house, warm and golden. Lila woke to the smell of coffee and pancakes. When she walked into the kitchen, the table was already set, and beside her plate lay an envelope with her name written in his familiar handwriting. Her heart skipped. "Charles," she called. There was no answer. She found him sitting in his chair by the window, the morning light spilling over him, peaceful, a faint smile on his face. The world stood still. She walked toward him slowly, her voice breaking, "Charles?" But there was only silence, soft and kind. Her tears came quietly, her hand resting over his heart where she could no longer feel its beat but still felt his warmth. When she opened the envelope, she found a letter. "My dear Lila," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I finally kept my last promise to go when the world was ready for you to stand without me. You gave me years I was never meant to have, and joy I did not deserve. You saved a broken man and taught him how to live with an open heart. Wherever you go, know that I am with you, not as a shadow, but as light. Be kind, be brave, and never forget that love is the only thing we leave behind that never fades. With all my heart, Charles." She folded the letter gently against her chest, the tears on her cheeks glistening in the morning light. Outside, the cherry blossoms had begun to fall again, covering the street like pink snow. Days later, the foundation organized a small ceremony to honor him. People from all walks of life attended, the workers he once employed, the families he had helped, the children from the clinic. Lila stood at the podium, her voice steady but soft. "He taught me that kindness is not a gift, it is a responsibility," she said. "And he taught me that second chances are real if we have the courage to take them." When she stepped away, the crowd rose to their feet in silence. Later, as evening fell, she returned to the house, lit the candle by the window, and sat at the piano. Her fingers moved slowly, tenderly, through the same melody she had played since childhood. Outside, the river shimmered beneath the stars, and for a moment, she could almost hear his voice again, warm and gentle, saying, "Be quiet and live." She smiled through her tears. "I am," she whispered. "I am living," and as the final notes faded into the night, the candle's flame flickered once, steady and bright, like a heartbeat that refused to fade, carrying his love forward forever.